Before we dive into this emotional roller coaster of a story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on Wildlife Legends for more heart-pounding tales of survival and wild beauty. Now, let's begin. The Arctic was nothing like it once was. The ice had receded faster than anyone could have imagined, and the once pristine expanse of snow-covered ground was being swallowed up by the encroaching sea. It was a silent battle that few humans could see but felt deeply in their bones. This was the world in which Jonah lived, a world slowly dying under the weight of climate change. Jonah had always loved the wild. Growing up near the frigid edge of the world in a small, isolated village in Alaska, he found solace in the harsh beauty of the Arctic. His father had been a fisherman, and he'd learned how to read the skies, the sea, and the land at an early age. But that world was slowly becoming unrecognizable. The news had become unbearable to hear. The glaciers were melting at alarming rates, and the polar bear population was dwindling as they struggled to find enough ice to hunt. Jonah had heard these reports, but it wasn't until he saw the unmistakable sign of a young polar bear cub wandering alone on the edge of a thinning ice floe that the news became something personal. Jonah had been out on a hunting trip with his crew, his rugged boat navigating the frozen waters with a practiced ease. The cold wind bit at his skin as he scanned the horizon. It was then that he saw the movement, a lone, small figure shuffling across the ice, far from any sign of the mother that should have been with it. His heart sank. No animal was meant to face the relentless cruelty of the Arctic alone, but this cub, no bigger than a child, was alone, its fluffy white coat standing out against the vast nothingness. Jonah had heard the stories. Polar bears were disappearing faster than anyone could keep up with. The cub he saw was likely already lost to the melting ice. Yet, something inside him stirred, a flicker of determination, of hope. He knew the stakes were high. The cub needed help. It wasn't a matter of simply reaching out to save it, this was life or death, both for the cub and for him. As Jonah steered his boat toward the ice floe, a strange tension gripped his chest. He had never seen a polar bear this close before. The legends of these animals had always been shrouded in awe and fear, majestic, dangerous, and untamable creatures of the wild. But this wasn't a fearsome predator. This was a young animal, a vulnerable creature facing the unthinkable. Jonah knew he had no choice but to help. If he didn't, the cub would almost certainly die out here alone. The journey wasn't easy. The boat rocked against the icy waters, the wind howling, and the sky clouded over as if nature itself was conspiring to stop him. Jonah's heart raced as he finally neared the ice floe, the small cub still wandering aimlessly, its fur now matted with snow and ice. The childlike innocence of its movements cut through Jonah's resolve, and he knew, deep down, that this was more than just an act of kindness. It was an act of survival. Jonah carefully maneuvered the boat closer to the ice, holding his breath as he prepared to make the leap. If he wasn't careful, the ice could crack beneath him, sending him into the freezing water below. He had no choice but to risk it. The cold wind bit at his face as he climbed out of the boat, his boots crunching against the frozen surface. The cub was now standing still, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the wind and the crashing waves fading into the background. Jonah locked eyes with the cub, and something passed between them, an unspoken bond, a desperate understanding that they were both fighting against the same force, the unstoppable changes in the world around them. But Jonah wasn't about to leave this cub to face the inevitable. He was going to fight for its life, no matter what it took. The bond between human and animal was forged in that instant. Jonah's every instinct screamed at him to be cautious, to retreat and return to the safety of his boat. But he couldn't. Not with the cub standing there, vulnerable and alone. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he neared the cub. Its fur was soft and cold to the touch, and for a brief moment, Jonah felt the weight of what he was doing, the responsibility he was taking on. This wasn't just a rescue mission. This was a fight for survival against the very forces that were killing the planet. As Jonah carefully scooped the cub into his arms, he could feel the weight of its small body, light yet fragile. He wasn't just saving this one cub. He was doing what he could to halt the devastation that was creeping across the land, one animal at a time. Jonah knew it would be a struggle to get the cub back to safety, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in his life, he truly understood the urgency of the fight against climate change. The ice floe groaned beneath their weight as Jonah made his way back toward the boat. The cub, still dazed and confused, clung to him for warmth, as though it had already realized its fate depended on him. Jonah's heart ached at the thought of how close it had come to death. But the struggle wasn't over yet. As he made his way back to the boat, the first signs of the storm began to churn on the horizon. He could feel the change in the air, an impending battle with nature that would test his every limit. Jonah didn't know it yet, but his life would never be the same. The choice he made on that day, to save the polar bear cub against all odds, would lead him into a battle of life and death. But the true shock, the twist that he could never have imagined, was still waiting for him. And it would change everything. Don't forget to subscribe to Wildlife Legends for more incredible stories of survival and emotional bonds in the wild. The storm hit with a brutal force, as if nature itself was punishing Jonah for daring to interfere with its cold, unyielding rain. The winds whipped around him, howling like a pack of wolves, as he gripped the small polar bear cub in his arms. The ice beneath him seemed to tremble, groaning with the pressure of the storm's fury. Every step he took felt like it could be his last, but there was no turning back now. The cub, still cradled in Jonah's arms, seemed oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Its large, round eyes stared up at him with a mixture of fear and trust, its soft fur pressing against his jacket. Jonah's heart ached as he looked down at the creature he had come to see as more than just an animal. In that moment, they were one, both fighting to survive, caught in a world that seemed to be crumbling around them. The boat was just ahead, barely visible through the curtain of snow that had begun to fall. Jonah's boots slipped on the ice as he fought against the wind, each step becoming more and more difficult. The cub's weight, though small, seemed to grow heavier with every moment, and Jonah's body screamed in protest as he pushed forward. But he refused to stop. Not now. Not when the cub's life depended on him. As he finally reached the edge of the boat, Jonah let out a breath of relief. The storm was worsening, and the ice was beginning to crack under their feet. He didn't know how much longer they could stay out here. The boat would only provide them with temporary shelter, but it was better than nothing. He gently placed the cub down on the deck, his hands trembling as he started the engine. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the waves and the ice, as the storm raged around them. For the first time in what felt like hours, Jonah allowed himself a moment to think. The cub had been so close to death, but Jonah had managed to get it back to the boat. Yet, in his heart, he knew the journey was far from over. The world they lived in had changed so drastically that survival had become a daily struggle, not just for humans, but for every creature on this planet. Jonah was fighting for the cub's life, but he was also fighting for the survival of the Arctic and for the future of the planet as a whole. As the boat cut through the storm, Jonah couldn't help but think about the changes he had witnessed in his lifetime. He had seen the glaciers recede, the ice sheets melt, and the once mighty polar bears struggle to find food. The Arctic was warming at an alarming rate, and the creatures that called it home were paying the price. But Jonah wasn't willing to give up. He couldn't. He had heard the scientists' warnings, seen the charts and graphs detailing the rapid loss of ice, but it wasn't until that moment, until he saw the cub, that he truly understood the gravity of the situation. The cub was a symbol of everything that was at risk: the loss of habitat, the destruction of ecosystems, the animals that would not survive. Jonah had to do something. He had to fight for this cub, and for the countless other animals facing the same fate. The boat rocked violently as the storm grew stronger, the waves crashing against the hull. Jonah's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles turning white as he steered the boat toward the safety of the shore. But he knew that safety was fleeting. The real fight was just beginning. As the shore finally came into view, Jonah's exhaustion hit him like a wave. His muscles ached, and his mind was foggy from the cold and the relentless storm. But he couldn't stop now. The cub's survival depended on him. The bond they had formed in those brief moments on the ice had become something unbreakable. With one final push, Jonah guided the boat toward the shore, the storm's fury still raging around them. As the boat came to a stop, he quickly scooped the cub back into his arms, rushing through the snow toward the shelter of the cabin he had built years ago. It was a small, sturdy structure, but it was enough to protect them from the elements. Inside, Jonah built a fire and wrapped the cub in warm blankets, watching as it shivered in his arms. The storm outside continued to howl, but in that small cabin, they were safe, at least for now. Jonah's mind raced as he thought about the long road ahead. The cub needed food, warmth, and care. But more than that, it needed hope. As he sat there, watching the cub slowly drift into a deep sleep, Jonah realized something: this wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about saving the cub. It was about something bigger. It was about the survival of the entire Arctic ecosystem and the future of the planet. Jonah had always known the power of nature, but now, more than ever, he understood the fragility of the world around him. The storm, the cub, the melting ice, it was all part of a larger, unstoppable force. But Jonah wasn't ready to give in. He wasn't ready to accept that this was the end. Not for the cub. Not for the polar bears. And not for the world. As he watched the fire crackle, Jonah made a vow to himself, and to the cub, who was now peacefully resting in his arms. He would fight for the Arctic. He would fight for every polar bear, every creature that called this place home. And he would fight against the forces that threatened to tear it all apart. The storm raged outside, but Jonah knew that the real battle was just beginning. And it was one he couldn't afford to lose. Jonah had always considered himself a man of action, someone who could face the harshest conditions without hesitation. But in the days that followed the storm, as he sat in the warmth of his cabin, taking care of the polar bear cub, something began to shift within him. The enormity of the situation, the climate change, the melting ice, the vanishing polar bears, was no longer something he could ignore. He was no longer just a man living in the Arctic, isolated from the rest of the world. He was now a part of something much bigger, something that demanded action. Each day, the cub grew stronger, its tiny body recovering from the ordeal. Jonah had taken it upon himself to care for it, feeding it small amounts of fish and keeping it warm by the fire. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing hour, and Jonah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for the cub's survival. He named it Tundra, after the vast, icy landscape that had brought them together. But despite Tundra's recovery, Jonah knew that he couldn't keep the cub forever. Polar bears belonged to the wild, not to a man's cabin. Jonah couldn't ignore the undeniable truth: Tundra needed to return to its natural home, to the ice and the cold, where it could learn to survive in a world that was rapidly changing. But how could he send the cub back into a world so different from the one it had known? The world outside the cabin had become a battleground. The Arctic, once a land of endless white, had begun to crumble under the weight of global warming. The ice that had once stretched for miles, providing a solid foundation for polar bears to hunt and roam, was now shrinking at an alarming rate. The temperatures were rising, and the bears were forced to adapt, to learn to survive in a world that was no longer theirs. Jonah had seen firsthand the devastating effects of climate change. He had witnessed the way the ice was melting, the way the land was slowly disappearing. He had seen the polar bears, once majestic creatures, growing weaker, struggling to find food as their habitat vanished before their eyes. He knew that if something didn't change soon, the Arctic would no longer be a place where polar bears could thrive. But what could he do? He was just one man, isolated in the wilderness, facing an issue so vast and complex that it seemed impossible to solve. Yet, Jonah couldn't sit idly by. Not now. Not when the cub, and every other polar bear, depended on people like him to take a stand. In the quiet moments when Tundra slept by the fire, Jonah's thoughts drifted back to the reports he'd heard, the pleas for action from scientists and environmentalists. The world was waking up to the reality of climate change, but it wasn't waking up fast enough. The changes happening in the Arctic were a direct result of human activity. The burning of fossil fuels, the deforestation, the pollution, all of it had contributed to the warming of the planet and the destruction of the Arctic. Jonah's mind raced as he thought about the future. He had no answers, no solutions that could reverse the damage already done. But he knew that he couldn't just sit by and let it continue. He had to do something, anything, to make a difference. He had been a fisherman for most of his life, a man who had always relied on the land and the sea for his survival. But now, he found himself thinking of the bigger picture, the survival of the entire planet. It wasn't just about the polar bears. It was about every living thing on Earth, from the tiniest insect to the largest mammal. They were all connected, all part of the delicate web of life that was being unraveled by the forces of climate change. Tundra stirred in its sleep, and Jonah snapped back to the present. He had to focus. The cub needed him now more than ever. But in his heart, Jonah knew that his responsibility didn't end with Tundra. He couldn't change the world on his own, but he could be part of something bigger. He could raise awareness, share his story, and encourage others to take action. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, Jonah grew more determined. He spent his time learning everything he could about polar bears, about the changes happening in the Arctic, and about what could be done to slow the devastation. He wasn't a scientist, and he wasn't a politician, but he could speak from the heart. He could share his experiences, his observations, and his passion for the wild world that was slipping away. The winds howled outside, and the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, Jonah had found a sense of purpose. He had found a reason to fight, not just for Tundra, but for every polar bear and every creature that depended on the Arctic. And he would fight with everything he had, because he knew that if the Arctic fell, it would be the beginning of the end for the entire planet. The battle ahead wouldn't be easy. It would require determination, courage, and a willingness to make hard choices. But Jonah was ready. He had already risked his life to save a polar bear cub, and now, he was ready to risk everything to save the Arctic. The fire crackled softly in the corner, and Jonah looked down at Tundra, who had curled up at his feet, its tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift, and Jonah allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had Tundra, and he had the world's eyes on him. It was time to turn that attention into action. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Jonah felt a spark of hope. And with that hope, he would fight. Jonah's resolve hardened as he realized the magnitude of the battle he was about to face. The Arctic was changing faster than anyone had anticipated, and with each passing day, it seemed as though the forces of nature were pushing back harder. The ice was receding at an alarming rate, and every piece of land that was once stable was now unpredictable and dangerous. In just a few short decades, the Arctic had transformed from a frozen wilderness to a land on the brink of collapse. Yet, as Jonah looked down at Tundra, who was now stronger and more alert, he realized that this tiny cub had become a symbol of hope. The world could still change, still be saved, if enough people cared enough to act. Jonah knew he had to do more than simply care. He had to speak up, make people listen, and show them the urgency of the situation. If the world could rally behind a cause as noble as saving a single polar bear, perhaps they would begin to see the larger issue at hand. The first step was to get Tundra back to the wild, where it truly belonged. Jonah couldn't keep the cub in the cabin forever. Despite the bond they had formed, he knew that the cub's survival depended on it being free. He couldn't protect it from the forces of nature forever. So, with a heavy heart, Jonah decided it was time to take Tundra back to the Arctic, to a place where the cub could learn to hunt, roam, and grow. But as he prepared for the journey, he realized that the world around him had changed in more ways than one. The once thriving Arctic wilderness, teeming with life, was now a shadow of its former self. The ice that once stretched for miles, providing a stable hunting ground for polar bears, was now broken and unstable. The waters were warmer, and the prey was harder to find. Jonah had seen the changes firsthand, and he knew that the task ahead would be no easy feat. The journey to release Tundra back into the wild was treacherous. Jonah had to navigate through shifting ice, treacherous waters, and fierce storms. But with every step, he felt the weight of his mission growing heavier. He was no longer just trying to save one cub. He was trying to save an entire ecosystem, to remind the world that the Arctic still mattered, and that the creatures who lived there deserved a chance to survive. As they traveled deeper into the Arctic wilderness, the landscape began to change. The ice was thinner now, and the towering glaciers that once dominated the horizon were slowly melting away. Jonah had seen the signs before, but now, they were undeniable. The Arctic was dying, and with it, so were the polar bears. He couldn't let tundra be another victim of climate change. The storm that had once raged outside his cabin now followed them, swirling around their small boat like a predator on the prowl. Jonah's heart raced as he fought to keep the boat steady, the icy waters splashing against the sides. The cub, now awake and alert, huddled close to him for warmth, its small body trembling in the freezing cold. Jonah held it close, determined to protect it, but also acutely aware that the world they were traveling through was no longer the same one it had been when he was younger. They finally arrived at a small patch of land, a last remnant of the vast ice fields that once stretched for miles. Jonah stepped off the boat and onto the cracked ice, holding Tundra tightly in his arms. The wind howled around him, the snow whipping into his face, but he barely noticed. His heart was in his throat, a mixture of fear and hope battling within him. This was the moment that could define everything. He gently placed Tundra on the ground, allowing the cub to stretch its tiny legs. The cub hesitated at first, its wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. It was still so small, so vulnerable, but Jonah knew that it had the strength to survive. This was its home, its birthright, and it had to find its way back to the wild. For a moment, Jonah stood still, watching as Tundra took a tentative step forward, then another. The cub's movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, but there was something in its eyes, a spark of curiosity, of instinct, that told Jonah that it would survive. It had to. The wind howled louder, the ice cracking beneath Jonah's feet, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He had to let go. He had to trust that the cub would find its place in this changing world, just as he had to trust that the world itself could still be saved. But in that moment, as Tundra took its first few steps on the shrinking ice, Jonah felt a pang of sadness. He knew that the world the cub was entering was not the one it was meant to inhabit. The ice was disappearing, and with it, the future of the polar bears. As he turned to leave, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Tundra's journey had only just begun, Jonah vowed to continue the fight. The world needed to know what was happening. People needed to understand that the destruction of the Arctic wasn't just the loss of a few icebergs, it was the loss of an entire ecosystem, an entire way of life. The polar bears were just the beginning. If they disappeared, who would be next? Jonah had already risked his life to save one cub. Now, he was risking everything to save an entire world. The road ahead would be long, and it would be filled with challenges, but Jonah was ready. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a messenger. And his message was clear: the Arctic was worth saving. The polar bears were worth saving. And as Tundra disappeared into the snow, Jonah knew that the fight was far from over. It had only just begun. Jonah's journey didn't end with leaving Tundra on the shrinking ice. That moment, while deeply emotional, was the beginning of something much larger. He had realized that the loss of the Arctic, and the disappearance of species like the polar bear, was not just an environmental crisis, it was a call to action for humanity. The world needed to understand what was at stake, and Jonah knew that he couldn't remain silent any longer. After returning to his cabin, Jonah began to reach out to every contact he had. He contacted environmental groups, scientists, and even politicians. He shared his story, the harrowing journey of saving Tundra and releasing it back into a world that was disappearing. He wrote articles, posted on social media, and gave interviews. But he didn't just talk about the polar bear, he talked about the broader issue of climate change and how it was affecting the Arctic, and in turn, the entire planet. Everywhere Jonah went, he carried with him a piece of the Arctic, a reminder of what was being lost. He used every opportunity to speak out, from small community meetings to large rallies. He became a voice for the voiceless, for the animals whose lives were being uprooted by the relentless march of climate change. But as much as Jonah tried to raise awareness, he found that many people were still disconnected from the reality of what was happening. Climate change felt like an abstract concept to some, something distant, something that wasn't affecting them directly. But Jonah knew the truth. He had seen it with his own eyes. He had witnessed the shrinking ice, the starving bears, and the encroaching storm that was slowly, inexorably, changing everything. The world needed to wake up. It needed to act. He spent countless hours talking to scientists, learning everything he could about the ways in which the Arctic was changing. What he learned was nothing short of terrifying. The Arctic was warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet, and the consequences were already being felt. The ice was melting at a rate that was unprecedented in human history, and species like the polar bear were already paying the price. In his conversations with scientists, Jonah began to understand the full scope of the crisis. The polar bears weren't just victims of a changing climate, they were a symbol of something much larger. The changes happening in the Arctic were a warning sign, a glimpse into what the rest of the world could face if action wasn't taken. The melting ice was the canary in the coal mine, and if the world didn't pay attention, it would be too late to reverse the damage. Jonah's mission became clear: he had to show the world the urgency of the situation. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He couldn't sit by and watch as the Arctic slipped away, along with the species that called it home. If he had to, he would go to the ends of the earth to make sure the world knew the truth. One day, while traveling to an environmental summit, Jonah was given the opportunity to speak to a large audience. It was a moment he had been waiting for, an opportunity to reach thousands, maybe even millions, of people. He stood before the crowd, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. This was his chance to make a difference. He spoke about tundra, about the journey he had undertaken to save the cub, and about the loss of the Arctic. He shared the stories of the polar bears, the seals, and the other creatures whose lives were being upended by the warming planet. But he also spoke about hope. He talked about the power of collective action and the possibility of reversing the damage if people came together to fight for the planet. "You might think," Jonah said, his voice carrying across the room, "that one person can't make a difference. But I'm living proof that we can. If we all take action, no matter how small, we can change the course of history. The Arctic might be melting, but it's not too late to save it." The room was silent as Jonah spoke, the weight of his words sinking in. When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause. But it wasn't just applause for Jonah, it was a call to action. People were listening. They were ready to fight. Over the next few weeks, Jonah's message spread far and wide. He appeared on news outlets, spoke to schoolchildren, and participated in climate change campaigns. The world was beginning to pay attention. People were starting to realize that the fate of the polar bears was a reflection of something much bigger, something that could affect every corner of the globe. But Jonah knew that even with all this newfound attention, the fight was far from over. He had ignited a spark, but it was up to others to fan the flames. It was up to governments, corporations, and individuals to make the changes necessary to save the planet. Despite the progress he had made, Jonah also knew that there was much more work to do. The forces that were driving climate change were powerful, and reversing the damage wouldn't be easy. But Jonah was no longer afraid of the challenge. He had seen the strength of the human spirit, and he knew that if people came together, they could accomplish the impossible. He returned to his cabin, the storm now a distant memory, and sat by the fire once more. Tundra's image flashed through his mind, and he knew that his work wasn't just about saving one cub, it was about saving an entire world. The Arctic, the polar bears, and every living creature on the planet depended on humanity waking up and taking action. Jonah had risked his life to save tundra, but he now understood that the stakes were even higher than he had ever imagined. The fight for the Arctic was the fight for the future. It was a battle worth every ounce of effort, every ounce of courage. And as he sat there, watching the flames dance in the fire, Jonah knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. But he would fight it with everything he had. He would fight it for tundra. He would fight it for the Arctic. He would fight it for the future of the planet. The weeks that followed Jonah's powerful speech marked the beginning of a global awakening. People who had never before considered the importance of the Arctic suddenly found themselves galvanized into action. Jonah's message had sparked something deep within the hearts of those who listened, a realization that the plight of the polar bears wasn't just an issue for the Arctic. It was an issue for humanity itself. The planet was fragile, and its survival depended on the collective actions of every person alive today. Jonah became a figurehead for the movement, his efforts leading to a series of rallies, marches, and petitions that stretched across the globe. The Arctic, once seen as an isolated region, was now in the global spotlight. Governments, corporations, and individuals all began to take notice, driven by the powerful emotional force Jonah had tapped into. The world was beginning to understand that the time for change was now, and it was clear that every action mattered. But with each step forward, Jonah also faced opposition. Powerful industries that had long benefited from the exploitation of natural resources in the Arctic began to push back. Their influence was vast, and they were determined to maintain the status quo. Yet Jonah was undeterred. He had already witnessed the consequences of inaction with his own eyes. He had seen the once mighty glaciers crumble, the ice floes melt, and the polar bears struggle to survive. He knew that this fight was bigger than any corporation, bigger than any political leader. It was a fight for the future of the planet. Jonah's message had struck a chord with a new generation, one that had grown up with the awareness of climate change and was determined to make a difference. These young activists, inspired by Jonah's dedication, took up the cause with relentless passion. They organized protests, wrote letters to world leaders, and used social media to spread the word. Jonah's call for action had become their rallying cry. The world's attention was no longer focused solely on the Arctic itself but on the larger issue of climate change. The melting ice wasn't just a problem for polar bears, it was a problem for every species, every ecosystem, and every person on Earth. The message was clear: if the ice continued to melt, the consequences would be catastrophic. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and the loss of biodiversity were just the beginning. Humanity's own survival was at stake. One day, Jonah received an unexpected call. It was from a powerful environmental organization that had been following his work. They had seen the impact his efforts had made, and they wanted to take things further. They were offering Jonah the opportunity to lead a groundbreaking expedition to the Arctic, where he could document the changes firsthand and bring the world's attention to the reality of climate change. The invitation was both an honor and a heavy responsibility. Jonah knew that the expedition would be dangerous, and the conditions in the Arctic had become increasingly volatile. But it was also an opportunity to capture the full extent of the crisis and to show the world what was at stake in the most compelling way possible. It was the chance to make a final, undeniable statement that the Arctic was not a distant land, but a vital part of the planet's ecosystem, and its survival depended on the actions of everyone. With little hesitation, Jonah agreed. He knew that he couldn't stop now. The fight for the Arctic, for the polar bears, and for the future of the planet, was more important than anything else. He packed his bags, gathered his team, and prepared for the journey that could change everything. As the team set sail toward the Arctic, Jonah looked out at the vast, frozen expanse of ocean that lay ahead. The sky was overcast, and the winds were bitterly cold, but Jonah felt a strange sense of peace. He had come so far, and though the road had been long, he knew that this was the next step in a much larger journey. The stakes had never been higher, but he had faith that the world was finally beginning to listen. They arrived at a remote Arctic island, one of the few places where the ice remained relatively stable. Jonah and his team began their work immediately, setting up cameras, taking measurements, and collecting data. But as they worked, they began to realize just how much the landscape had changed. The ice was thinner than it should have been, cracking and breaking underfoot. The team's progress was slowed by the constant shifting of the ground beneath them. The once stable environment they had hoped to document was now a fragile, unstable wilderness. During their stay on the island, Jonah experienced something that would stay with him forever. Late one night, as he stood outside the camp, he heard the unmistakable sound of a polar bear's roar. His heart leapt in his chest as he followed the sound, knowing that this was a rare, precious moment. He rounded a corner and saw a lone polar bear, standing on a small patch of ice, staring out at the horizon. The bear was magnificent, majestic, yet solemn. Its fur was matted, and it appeared thinner than Jonah had ever seen, the toll of the shrinking ice evident in its appearance. The bear stood there for what felt like an eternity, as though it were waiting for something. Jonah couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the creature. This was Tundra's world. This was the world that was slipping away. Jonah slowly approached, not wanting to disturb the bear. As he stood there, watching the animal, a deep sense of loss washed over him. He realized that the battle for the Arctic was not just about saving polar bears or glaciers, it was about saving the very soul of the planet. The Arctic was a reminder of the Earth's resilience, but it was also a reflection of how much had already been lost. As the polar bear turned and disappeared into the night, Jonah knew that this journey, this fight, was far from over. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was no longer fighting alone. The world was waking up, and with every step, every voice, every action, they were bringing the Arctic back into focus. Jonah looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above him, and whispered a silent promise to the polar bears, to the Earth, and to himself: he would not give up. Not now. Not ever. The battle for the future was just beginning. And he would fight for it with everything he had.